Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Lee Watts, and I'm the Director of Federal Affairs at the American Society for Microbiology. We're here today to talk about how current federal funding decisions affect microbial research. I'm joined today by Dominic Ruscio, partner at CRD Associates. Today, we're going to provide a quick overview of advocacy, and I'll share more about how you can engage with ASM in this work. We're also going to dive in to the federal budget and appropriations process so you can learn more about how it works and sometimes how it doesn't work. So many of you may be asking, why should I advocate? And I hope the fact that you're tuning into this presentation means that you already understand why this is so important. But just in case, you are the face of microbial research, and you have an important story to tell. You also have a perspective and you have expertise that members of Congress and their staff can use to make decisions. The microbial sciences, as you know, is a diverse field that holds the key to solving many of our most challenging problems, from emerging pathogens like COVID-19 to climate change and carbon fixation. You can help. And lastly, you're a constituent. Members of Congress are elected to represent your interests. And if that isn't enough to convince you, it's your constitutional right as an American. The First Amendment specifically says that we have a right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And that's exactly what advocacy is in many ways. So ASM has made a conscious decision over the last couple of years to invest in policy and advocacy. It is an important way that the society can both engage and serve its more than 30,000 members around the globe. It's a critical component to ASM's mission. Because the federal government is the single largest funder of basic, translational, and clinical research, it is important that ASM be a voice at the table to ensure that that funding remains robust and sufficient in order for the field to continue its important work. Very simply, without this federal funding every year, there would be far fewer grants and arguably no public health programs. There's also a saying here in Washington that if you're not at the table, you're on the table. Each year, Congress makes decisions on federal funding for science, for programs, for public health, and every year there are winners and there are losers. It's critically important that you be a voice at the table to advocate for what you care about, so that when members of Congress are making these difficult decisions, they understand why it's important to continue to funding research and the public health programs that we care about. In other words, advocacy is critical to research funding, advancing science, and promoting. So we talked a little bit about the why. What about the how? By tuning into events like this, you can better understand the process, and ASM is here to help. You also can learn to tell your story. And engaging with policymakers is an important part of that, and knowing how to tell your story is one way that you can most effectively communicate with members of Congress. We are your partner in advocacy, and we are here to help. There are many ways that the American Society for Microbiology makes it easy for you to be an advocate. We can help you make connections to your policymakers, assist with messaging. We also connect to the broader scientific and public health community. We work to develop champions for the microbial sciences. It's very important that there are members of Congress who make our work a priority in their work. And so when they are at those tables making those decisions, they have science at top of mind. We also keep track of the myriad bills that come through Congress every session that touch in some way on research or on public health. We also continue to think of innovative ways to engage you and create advocacy opportunities for you, whether you are here in Washington or whether you are at home. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember this: what happens in Washington affects your research. Now I will turn it over to Dom.
Thanks, Mary Lee. And for those of you who want to get engaged in advocacy, my assignment today is to is to give you some background on what's going on in Congress in a way that maybe will make you feel a little more comfortable when you do advocate on behalf of ASM. Folks in Congress tend to think that we all dialogue and government speak. So what we're going to do is review some of just a few common terms that you are likely to hear from members of Congress or from staff. We'll walk you through the appropriations process that funds the key priorities of ASM. But with one caveat, and that's that the process never seems to go as it's supposed to. So you have to be flexible as an advocate. We'll give you a snapshot of where the appropriations process stands right now. And then finally, a little crystal balling as to what the rest of the year is going to look like. So in a very real sense, you're going to be acting as citizen advocates, which is a much nicer connotation than lobbyist, which is what my job is. But as you'll see from this slide, it's all a matter of perspective. As far as the jargon you may hear in your meetings, there are two terms that often come up, and those are authorization versus appropriation. Now, the media, when it's reporting on legislation passing Congress, often is a little bit misleading because we assume that once legislation is passed, that money begins to flow. And a good example of this is for the past 3 years, the childhood cancer community had been advocating for programs to expand basic and clinical research as well as biorepositories. Now that legislation passed last year and the cancer community was elated. The problem was there was no money provided for that. This was authorizing legislation. Legislation authorized these programs to be set up and authorized money to be spent, but nothing happens. No money flows until it's appropriated by Congress. So essentially, authorizing legislation sets parameters for a new program or a new policy, but again, no money flows until it goes through the appropriations process. Another set of terms that you're likely to hear referred to are discretionary versus mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is just what it sounds like. These are programs in the federal government over which Congress has discretion to fund or not fund every year. Just to kind of put this in perspective, the total federal budget is just under $5 trillion. Discretionary programs account for less than about a third of that. More than half of the discretionary money goes towards Homeland Security and defense. So that leaves about $700 billion to fund all of the rest of the government. That's NIH, that's NSF, public health, health professions training, education, transportation, agriculture, and so forth. So again, discretionary is a part of the discretionary spending is part of the federal budget that falls within the purview of the appropriations committees and through annual appropriations. The term mandatory spending, on the other hand, that refers to programs where spending takes place automatically. You often hear people refer to entitlement programs. These are like Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. These are the programs that account for more than 2/3 of the federal budget. The rub here, and the reason I raise this is because you may encounter people people in Congress talking about federal spending being out of control. Well, that's because mandatory spending is growing exponentially. But for politicians, it's easier to cut discretionary spending, health, education, transportation, than it is to cut entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. So we end up oftentimes being the target of deep budget cuts when in fact we're not the big spenders. We're not the drivers of federal spending. These next two slides will set out the major benchmarks in the appropriations process. And I've included some general timeframes here, so you just get a sense of where we are in the process. But again, Congress rarely ever meets its deadlines. So I think, and you'll see that later on as we get into more detail. The opening shot each year begins when the president submits a budget proposal to Congress. And that budget proposal is intended to fund the government for the next fiscal year, which begins 8 months later in October. Um, Ordinarily, the next step in the process is for Congress to come up with an overall spending plan and then allocate how much of that plan goes to education or to health or to housing. Excuse me. Those are always very tough decisions to make. And politicians, being who they are, and this being an election year, they decided this year not to make those decisions. So what we've ended up with, and where we stand right now, is a democratically controlled House of Representatives, spending more money than it spent last year, while the Republican-controlled Senate wants to freeze spending at last year's levels. So then, but the next step in the process is when the appropriations subcommittees meet, they hold hearings, listen to government witnesses, listen to outside witnesses describe budgetary needs, and then, excuse me, the subcommittees then come up with recommendations on a program by program basis. Once a subcommittee makes those recommendations, goes to a full committee, gets ratified, and then is sent to the floor of the House of Representatives to be debated and passed. And then the process repeats itself in the Senate side. Eventually, after the House and Senate have both passed legislation, they meet together to work out their differences, and there are always invariably differences between the House bill and the Senate bill. They work out a compromise, it gets voted on, and then is sent to the president, where the president signs or vetoes the legislation. Yeah, this is pretty much a description of where things stand this year. We'll get into the specifics in a few minutes, but suffice it to say that just about everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. To understand that, let's take a look at where the various appropriations bills stand right now, beginning with COVID stimulus legislation. And you've probably read about this for the last several months. Congress has already been working on COVID legislation. They passed a series of COVID-related bills. The most recent was back in March. It was called the CARES Act. It included close to $1 billion in new funding for NIH and $4.3 billion for CDC. Obviously, that's a lot of money, and particularly given overall spending limits that Congress has imposed on itself. But the way Congress gets around that for things like this COVID stimulus bill is to declare this a national emergency, much like a natural disaster, a hurricane, or an act of war. By declaring legislation an emergency, it takes it out from under any kind of spending limits that Congress has imposed on itself. Even after this legislation was passed back in March, the CARES legislation, the House of Representatives decided more has to be done. So they, back in May, passed the what's called the HEROES Act, $3.5 trillion. And a big chunk of that would go to NIH, including funds to offset the costs related to cuts in laboratory productivity. After the House bill passed in May, that's when the process all but broke down. For weeks, the Senate leadership, Mitch McConnell and others, refused to consider passing any other legislation. There were fights over the size of unemployment benefits that people should receive. Probably read a lot about that. Whether or not schools should be incentivized to reopen classrooms this fall. And there was a whole host of other issues, including post office funding. because of the issues of mail-in ballots. Finally, and this was actually just occurred last night, the Senate Republicans unveiled a very trimmed down bill, their version of a stimulus bill. We don't have a lot of details. In fact, I'm just looking over some of this now. 29 billion to prepare for and respond to COVID, including development of countermeasures and vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and the purchase of vaccines. Another 16 billion for testing, contact tracing, surveillance, containment, and mitigation to monitor COVID. But even I think it was within an hour after that bill was released on the Senate side, the majority leader there, Mitch McConnell, said that he just didn't think they'd be able to pass any legislation anytime soon. Yeah, and again, this is probably indicative of where this year is right now. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of what's going to happen for the next fiscal year while Congress debates COVID stimulus legislation, we do have to keep the government running, and the fiscal year is starting October 1, just a few weeks away. As this slide indicates, the House has passed most of the appropriations bills, all but Homeland Security and legislation bill. As I mentioned before, the Senate can't seem to reach any agreement on how much it wants to spend this year. And to be honest, I think the biggest obstacle right now is senators don't want to take some hard votes on the budget before the election day. So in all likelihood, I think science funding and everything else is going to be put off until after the elections. So you might wonder, well, if Congress hasn't passed the appropriations bills before the start of the new fiscal year, what happens? Do we shut down? Well, fact of the matter is, there's an app for that. If Congress cannot reach an agreement on appropriations before the start of a new fiscal year, essentially what Congress does then is pass what's called a continuing resolution, or a CR. And that essentially puts the government on in a state of suspended animation, if you will. It's a time when you cannot stop a program and you cannot start a new program. Federal officials are not allowed to award new grants or contracts other than no-cost extensions. They can't sponsor any travel or travel themselves to any scientific conferences. And any unspent money from projects that have already been completed just sits there. It cannot be used to start up anything new. Now, continuing resolutions were originally intended to last for a couple of weeks or maybe a month at most. It was essentially stopgap funding, but they have been known to last several months, even for a full year. So from a science perspective, a continuing resolution of any significant length means that research opportunities can be delayed or perhaps even lost forever if somebody decides they're going to go into another area or go into research in another country. So what's ahead? Excuse me, in terms of what we can expect, I think election year politics are going to be driving everything for the rest of the year. A few days ago, Democrats signaled a willingness to try to work something out on a stimulus package, a COVID stimulus, and the White House said they were willing to do so as well. But so far, there have been a couple of discussions by phone. Nobody has budged. I'm guessing, I'm hoping, I think, that something to do with COVID gets passed either late September or sometime in October, early October, before Congress breaks for the elections. But I don't have, I can't be positive about that. So I think what happens next in terms of funding for next year, it all depends on the outcome of the elections. If Joe Biden wins and or the Democrats take over the Senate, I think funding decisions are going to be put off until next year. I think the Democrats will wait until a new president is sworn in, until a new Senate is sworn in, and then they have more control over the funding decisions. If President Trump wins and the Senate remains under Republican control, I think we're back to the same situation we find ourselves in now, and perhaps we might see some progress on appropriations during a lame duck session after the elections. So all in all, I think this is kind of where we stand. Thank you.
So now that you understand more about the process and where things stand, what's next? So first, you want to frame your message, and you want to think about the different angles here. What agency funds your research? How and who does your research help? If it's basic, fundamental research, then what are some of the potential downstream effects it could have on the lives of plants, animals, or humans? How have these dollars affected your career? Were you on a training grant early in your career? Did you do a postdoctoral fellowship? Congress thinks in terms of big dollar amounts, and you've heard some of those large dollar amounts during this presentation: millions, billions, and trillions. So one of the important things to do as an advocate and a scientist with an individual grant is to take those large numbers and bring it down to the individual level, into the real world. What do those billions that go to federal science agencies mean when it comes to your grant and funding your work? We're not going to go into specific requests for agencies in this presentation, but you can see here a few of the many federal departments and agencies whose work touches on the microbial sciences and that fund many of the grants that are advancing the field. This is not an exhaustive list, but I would say that the 5 here, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, USDA research programs, and the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Science are the ones where we spend most of our time, as they fund the majority of the microbial science grants. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation that ASM is a partner to you. And so I want to make you aware of some of the resources we have. We developed a policy framework that undergirds all of our work here in Washington and articulates what ASM stands for. Funding the microbial sciences is a theme across all areas of the framework, from health to energy and environment to agriculture. We also have fact sheets that we have produced, and they're adapted each year, and that help to bring home what the funding means in any given area. So these are just additional tools that we have available to you on the ASM website that you can use when you're advocating. So with that, I want to thank you for tuning into this presentation. Here you can see 2 ways that you can connect with us. First, you can send us an email at advocacy@asmusa.org, or visit us online where you can see the fact sheets, you can see our policy framework, and other statements and messages that we have been sending in Washington at the website you see here, www.asm.org/advocacy. Thank you.